Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Mark Leary. He is professor of psychology and neuroscience at Duke University in the US. Dr. Leary has taught at Denison University, the University of Texas at Austin, and Wake Forest University. His research interests focus on social motivation and emotion and on processes involving self-reflection and self-relevant thought. He has written or edited 12 books and over 200 scholarly articles and chapters. He was the 2010 recipient of the Lifetime Career Award from the International Society for Self and Identity and the 2015 co-recipient of the Scientific Impact Award from the Society for Experimental Social Psychology. So, Dr. Leary, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so basically today I've already referred to a couple of topics in the introduction that we're going to cover today. But basically I think we're going to talk about people's identity, what we call the self, right? And basically the way people deal with their social environment and what happens when they are socially excluded in a way or another and how they deal with that, basically. So
Okay.
the first thing I would like to ask you is, what is really this concept of the self about? Because I guess it's a bit controversial because there are people in some areas that say that probably the thing we identify with in our mind, that is our sense of identity, is not really real. So what right. So what would you have to say about that?
Uh, in looking at the literature, not only in psychology, but in philosophy and other fields, we were able to find 12 completely distinctive ways in which people have used the word self. So it's almost a meaningless term because it's been used so many different ways. I don't even let my students use it. I usually don't use it. Now, I'll use words with self with a hyphen after it because we know what a self-concept is, for example, or a self-identity. The self, I don't use the word. If I had to define it, I would say that our self is the cognitive apparatus that allows us to think consciously about who we are and what we're like and what we're doing. So it's just a set of cognitive mechanisms that are responsible for self-reflection. So everything that psychologists study that involves, quote, the self, has something to do with these processes that are involved in self-reflection and what their implications are. But I would never try to just define the self and say we're studying the self. We're studying processes that involve people's ability to think consciously about themselves.
And what is the relationship between the self and what some people call the ego? Because there are several different things associated with the ego and mechanisms like egocentrism, egoicism, egotism. Could you give us perhaps a brief account of how we should look at those sorts of things?
Sure. The word ego is as messy as the word self. And again, I really have encouraged social psychologists not even to use the word. If you think about the origin of the word ego, it's really the Latin word for what we would think of as I, the capital letter I. So anything having to do with the ego is really people thinking about themselves. I did this, I think this, I'm this kind of person. Now, it has a lot of additional meanings. Freud used it in a particular way. When you get into the terms you used, people use it in different ways. But I try not to use it. Again, it's just people focused on I, me. That's the ego. So I don't like to get too tied up in the definitions because they go back hundreds of years and they're a terrible mess. So I encourage people to use much more specific terms that make it really clear what part of self-reflection are we really talking about.
Mm-hmm. And what are the components of our minds, that is, the mental mechanisms or cognitive mechanisms that people have at their disposal and that they use to move in their social environments and perhaps keep track of their self-worth and their self-esteem. I don't know if you already want to introduce a sociometer theory here or not associated with this question, but what are perhaps some of the main mechanisms that people should know about when it comes to those sorts of issues, let's say?
One thing I find really interesting when you think about it from the cognitive standpoint is that these are probably very different abilities. In other words, the capacity to think about your future and to project yourself into the future is probably a different cognitive capacity than to evaluate yourself and what you're like. And that's probably a different cognitive capacity than trying to figure out what other people think about you. So all of the different things that are involved in self-reflection, I think the cognitive psychologists have to help us, because I don't have the answer to this, have to help us understand what are the individual mechanisms that are associated with all the different types of conscious self-reflection human beings engage in, some of which we share with animals, like being able to recognize ourselves in mirrors. That's a different process than me projecting myself 20 years into the future. So not much work is done on this. We know the parts of the brain, or at least the neuroscientists do, I have not studied that myself, that are associated with self-thought. But I think these are independent cognitive mechanisms or modules for different types of self-thinking.
Mm-hmm. And to what extent do people deal consciously with their position in society and how well they're doing? Because, I mean, in your work you talk about the sociometer theory, that is basically people keeping track of how they're doing in life and in their social environments and how they relate to other people and things like that, right? But isn't it also the case that since people have a lot of biases and heuristics, that perhaps they distort reality a little bit and they don't have proper access to their real position in society and if they're doing really well or not? I mean, there's that interplay there, and even these things, most of them don't occur at a conscious level, and people don't have conscious access to how our brains process those sorts of information, right?
Oh, you're absolutely true. So many of our self-thoughts are about how we're getting along with other people and how they perceive us and whether they like us and accept us and respect us. So in order to understand how we interact with other people, we have to think about how are we processing information about what other people think about us. Now, you're absolutely right. A lot of that is happening non-consciously. You can find yourself in a social situation where everything's going fine and you're interacting smoothly, and suddenly you just non-consciously pick up on a little cue that other people are bored with you, or they're looking for somebody else to talk to, or they have a puzzled look on their face. And it's not that you're consciously thinking all of the time, what are they thinking about me? What are they thinking about me? But you're detecting it at a non-conscious level. I mean, it's that important that it's automatized so that we're detecting that. That's a little harder to study than our conscious self-thoughts. But we do think about, how am I coming across? What impression am I making? What impression do I want to make? How much are these people accepting me? What kind of a person am I? Do I fit in here? So our social lives are filled with our self-thoughts, and we cannot begin to understand human behavior in social contexts without thinking about how we think about ourselves. Now, you mentioned the sociometer model. That was an effort to try to understand, what does self-esteem do? For the first half of my career, I stayed away from self-esteem like it was the plague. I didn't understand it. It was related to all sorts of things, but nobody had a good explanation for what it does. We're not talking about self-confidence. We know what self-confidence does. Your beliefs that you can actually do something and accomplish a goal, you can see what the function of that would be. But why would just how good you feel about yourself? That's what self-esteem is. What would that do, and why is it better to feel good about yourself than bad about yourself? And nobody had adequately answered that question. What we finally determined was that those feelings of that we call self-esteem is not really our evaluation of ourselves. It's our assumption about other people's evaluations of us and whether they perceive us as being a valuable person who has some relational value to them, and the degree to which they're likely to accept or reject us. So the things we feel good about, when I say I have high self-esteem, I feel good about myself, those are circumstances in which I believe other people value their relationship with me. It's an internal indicator that alerts me to the fact, keep doing what you're doing. You're being valued by others. You're being socially accepted. When our self-esteem goes down, when we fail, we humiliate ourselves, we're rejected, those are indications to us that something is wrong. People are not perceiving you positively, and you risk social rejection. So it's like a warning signal, like a lot of negative emotions are. That feeling that we call low self-esteem is a warning signal that motivates us to take a look at what's happening around you. What are you doing? And should you change your behavior to increase your acceptance and relational value? So it was a reformulation of what self-esteem is all about that seems to be pretty consistent with the existing literature.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, it seems that there are still a lot of open questions here and things that people have not yet properly addressed and answered. Is there any well-established, scientifically speaking, of course, any well-established relationship between self-esteem and things like depression and suicide?
In the case of depression and suicide, yes. But it's not that the low self-esteem is causing people to be depressed or to contemplate suicide. It's the fact that feeling that you're not being socially accepted, that you don't have relational value to other people, that lowers your self-esteem, because self-esteem seems to be this monitor that assesses your value to other people. And feeling like you're not accepted by others and you're on the outside and you're rejected creates the kind of depression that sometimes leads people to think of killing themselves. Now, it's not that being rejected automatically causes people to want to commit suicide, but it is so painful as a human being to be rejected, to be ostracized, to feel like no one supports you. The people who think about killing themselves, in some ways, it's not so much they want to end their own life, they just want to stop that pain. And that pain that's built into the human beings that we experience when our feelings are hurt, when we feel rejected, that pain is there to signal us that we need to be doing something to improve our relationships with other people. Throughout evolutionary history, if you were rejected by members of your group, you wouldn't survive. You had to be accepted by the clan. And so we're designed to experience intense emotional pain and distress when we don't feel like we're being adequately accepted. So that's when people want to kill themselves because they've been rejected. It's really just to stop that pain. It's the same sense of somebody actually having physical pain, like a really serious, painful disease, think about killing themselves sometimes. So there's not an automatic link between low self-esteem and either depression or suicide.
Mm-hmm. In your work, do you also consider an evolutionary account of things, that is, the fact that we are a social animal? I mean, this is due mostly to our evolutionary history, the fact that we had to live in groups and evolve in social circumstances, in social groups, and to depend on other people to survive and to reproduce, of course, to solve every one of the relevant evolutionary problems that we had to deal with, basically. So do you consider that? Because it seems to me that at least when it comes to the need to belong to a social group in a way or another, that it is a cross-cultural human universal. That is, there's not a big difference between even individualistic and collectivistic societies in terms of people really feeling bad if they are socially ostracized or excluded in any way, and if they don't have any social relationships and things like that.
Oh, absolutely true. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but I have certainly borrowed very heavily from evolutionary psychology. Many of the things I study do seem to be universals. They seem to be very powerful. And I think it's important for psychologists to think about, well, where did these tendencies come from? Now, that doesn't really answer how they play out in everyday life, particularly in the modern world. But I do like to think about what is the evolutionary function of our efforts to be accepted, of our desire to make impressions on other people. We did research on hurt feelings. Where does that come from? That has an evolutionary source. So yes, no, everything you said is absolutely correct. Underlining everything that I do is my own belief that fundamentally we are evolved social creatures, as you said, because that provided reproductive advantages for millions and millions of years. And we're now in a context where we're not living in that environment anymore, so those things don't always work like they once did. But I think it's an important consideration in understanding these topics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so another issue I would like to explore here is the one that has to do with self-presentation, because I mean it's not simply that we have a universal way of self-identifying and presenting ourselves socially, but it is sort of also constructed, let's say, in a way that it depends a little bit on the society we are part of and the role we fulfill in that society, and basically we construct this way by which we or this sense of self that we have and how we present ourselves to other people, and basically the way we expect things to work have to do with that sense of identity that we build for ourselves, right? Am I wrong here, or?
No, you're absolutely right, and there's a couple of issues there. I sometimes like to say that when we interact with other people, we're not really interacting with them as people. We're interacting with each other in terms of the impressions that we have of each other. That's all we have. When I interact with you, you have impressions of me and I have impressions of you. What that means is our impressions are critically important to just basic social interactions. And human beings are such complex individuals that they can't show everything they are and everything about them simultaneously. So we do pick and choose. I mean, that's what self-presentation is fundamentally about. Picking and choosing what impressions do I want to make to this particular person in this particular social context in order to meet my social goals. Most of the time, they're perfectly accurate. They change across situations, but these are all parts of us that we're showing or sometimes hiding from other people. Now, of course, we all know that we also all exaggerate sometimes the impressions we present. We also know that people present impressions that are completely untrue. So people can distort the process. But I always like to stress that self-presentation is not necessarily deceptive. I think it conjures up in a lot of people's minds that we're being Machiavellian, that we're just chameleons, just changing our face for other people. And we are, but it's not necessarily deceptive. It's very often accurate. So I'm fascinated by the fact that there is almost no social context in which we can afford to be oblivious to the impressions we're making on other people. I sometimes meet people who say, oh, I don't care what people think of me in the least. I don't have any concerns at all. But it's not true. And you can see it's not true when something happens where they're embarrassed. For example, embarrassment is a reaction to believing you've made an undesired social impression. We live with a concern that we want to make the right kinds of impressions on other people, the ones that sort of further our goals. It's a delicate dance because sometimes you can't make all of the impressions you would like to make. And making one impression of looking highly competent, for example, may undermine making other impressions like wanting to be liked and wanting to appear friendly. But we're really good at this. I mean, this is part of, it's evolved too. We grew up in social groups and had to conjure up different impressions for different people in different contexts.
Mm-hmm. Right, so basically we have a set of personality traits and different people, I mean there is inter-individual variation among people and there are at least certain ways by which people interact in predictable ways independently of the context. Let's say there are people that are a little bit more shy, there are other people that are more extroverted, other people that are more conscientious, and a lot of different things. But on the other end, people also sort of tweak those personality traits according to their specific goals in the specific context that they're in, and they also create expectations both for themselves and for the people they're going to interact with.
Absolutely. And not only are they tweaking them intentionally, But each one of us, even though we have a stand on any personality trait, as you're saying, we have a particular standing. You know, maybe I'm more shy than you are, or you're more extroverted than I am, or I'm more conscientious. But within each of us, we show a lot of variability, honest variability. Even a highly conscientious person sometimes blows things off and is not conscientious. And sometimes shy people can force themselves to be outgoing. So there, in fact, research shows there's as much variability within each of us in the behaviors we display as there is differences among people, across people in personality. Each of us gravitates to a certain point on a personality continuum where, yes, I tend to be this conscientious most of the time, but still we show a lot of variability. So some of the variability we see across situations is self-presentational. Sometimes it's more important for me to appear conscientious than others. Some of that variability is just natural variability in personality within a person, because we're not locked into just one point on some personality continuum.
Mm-hmm. So we create this sort of self-identity and self-narrative, and we try to stick with those mental constructs, right? And basically what happens when we are not able to fulfill those ways we construct our lives to be, let's say?
Well, if you mean, what happens when we don't feel we're making the impressions on others that we think are in our best interests in a particular context, which happens a lot. The primary thing that happens is those are the occasions in which we feel socially anxious. A lot of times we walk in and we're confident and the conversation goes well. Other times people experience social anxiety, and social anxiety where you're giving a talk, you're being interviewed, you're in a job interview, you're going out on a first date with somebody. That social anxiety is always about a concern with my public identity, with the impressions I'm making on other people. As long as we think we're making the impressions that we want, you don't feel anxious. The anxiety creeps in when there's some uncertainty. Of course, people differ on that as well. Some people walk through life much more concerned with their impressions, much more doubtful they'll make the impressions they would like to make, and they're going to be more socially anxious than those of us who think, well, yeah, I usually make a reasonably good impression. So, yeah, people suffer a lot. The socially anxious people of the world suffer a lot because of their concerns with their impressions.
Mm-hmm. But there's also this broader narrative that we create to ourselves and our lives that we expect to fulfill, and as life goes on and as it unfolds, we expect for things to go in a certain direction that we create as a sort of an expectation and things like that. So we also have to take into account not only the several specific social contexts we move in, but also the broader identity that we create for ourselves and that sometimes we fail to fulfill.
Absolutely. Yeah, the narratives we create are really interesting, and I haven't really studied those much, but there's a lot of research on that, because we have a narrative of what brought us to where we are at this moment. From the time we were born till now, if you sort of told your story about how did you get here and what you were like and how you changed, that's part of the narrative. And then you've got a story about who am I right now? Well, what's my life like? What am I trying to do? And then we have this future thing you're talking about, our future self that we imagine becoming, our aspirations. And in our own minds, those things are usually pretty coherent and linked. We make sense out of our lives with that kind of a narrative, but it's really artificial. It's not nearly the nice, clean, coherent story that we make it out to be. The problem is, as we think about our futures and our identities and what we want and what we want to become, we have so little control over some of that people do fail, at their aspirations to become a certain kind of person and have a particular identity. And that creates a lot of distress for people. What that means is that people should not be too tightly committed to a particular narrative about where things are going to go. The more flexible people can be about how their life is going to turn out and who they're going to become, the much happier they are, as opposed to someone who has a very narrow view of where things are going to go. And then when it doesn't work out, which it probably won't perfectly, then they're going to be distressed about that. Our identities are really important in telling us how we fit into social contexts. but they can also trap us into sort of inflexibility. Once we think we're a certain kind of person on a certain track, it cuts off other opportunities and options in our minds. So I always have felt like that identity is a double-edged sword. You've got to have it to function. You need to know who you are and where you're headed, but if it's too narrow, you're going to suffer. And don't make up stories about yourself that you're going to pursue, because they're not going to turn out the way you expect.
Mm-hmm. So in your work, you also talk about processes like self-compassion, self-reflection, and things like that. Do these mechanisms also work for people to deal with things like social exclusion, for example?
Well, self-compassion in particular is something I've been focused on the last few years. Most of us are really hard on ourselves when bad things happen. When we mess up, or we fail, or we're rejected, we blame ourselves, we catastrophize, we talk to ourselves negatively. And there's plenty of research showing that if you don't do that, if you treat yourself kindly, with more care and concern and compassion, you can get through the troubles of life much more easily. When our friends, our family, and other loved ones hit bumps in the road, when they suffer and things go wrong, we treat them really nice. We say kind things to them. In our own minds, though, when those things happen to us, we sometimes beat ourselves up pretty badly. So here's a case where you take two people experiencing exactly the same problem in life, and depending on how they talk to themselves about it and how harsh versus nice they are, they're going to have completely different reactions, both emotionally and behaviorally, in terms of how to solve it. I think the average person underestimates how important their self-thoughts are to the quality of their life. It's not just what happens out here in the world, it's how do we think about what it means for us and what it means for our life. And self-compassion is a great example of how to sort of buffer against some of the stresses of life by just talking to yourself in a nicer way when you mess up and you fail and you're rejected and other bad things happen.
Mm-hmm. So is this a general tendency that people have to be harsh toward themselves when they mess up in life, or something bad happens, or they make a mistake? Is that a general tendency that people have, or does it vary according to the personality traits? Or
well, all characteristics do both of those things. So yes, self-compassion varies. Sometimes I'm harder on myself than at other times, but it does differ across people. So it operates something like a trait. You see very distinct differences. And we just finished a big 4-year longitudinal study of university students, trying to understand what are the predictors of well-being from the time you start university until you finish 4 years later. Of course, there's a lot of different predictors of psychological well-being, but one of the strongest predictors was self-compassion, measured before they even started school. Following them for 4 years, the students who came in already being more self-compassionate, during the time they were at university, they were less depressed and anxious. They were more satisfied with their lives. They said that the worst things that happened to them each semester were less upsetting and disruptive to their life. They didn't experience less bad things. They just didn't heap on as much negative self-thought to whatever had happened, and so they didn't make the bad thing even badder. So self-compassion, again, it does vary across situations, but it is something like a personality characteristic as well.
So the self-compassion ability has at least a correlation with certain life outcomes?
Yes, absolutely. Not just emotional outcomes, but there's even evidence that people with higher self-compassion stay more motivated when they fail. Let's say they fail in a class. More self-compassionate students stick with it more. Why? Because they're not beating themselves up about it. They're treating themselves kindly and getting through the problem they're having. If you're low in self-compassion, once you've failed, you just continue to beat yourself up, and class becomes a more and more negative experience. So yes, it has behavioral outcomes as well.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, as any other traits, it has to be moderated in some way, because if we are too self-compassionate, perhaps we also get bad results from that, right?
Yes, if it turns into self-complacency or just letting yourself go, I kind of think that's not really compassion. In other words, if you were treating a friend well who was having a problem, I don't know if it's compassionate to say, it doesn't matter, don't worry about it at all, it's perfectly okay. if that's not true, I mean, you want people to have a realistic view. And if you're being compassionate, you want the best for somebody. And the best for somebody is not to say, don't worry about it at all. It's okay that you failed. That doesn't make any sense. It's more to say, yes, you failed. And that's bad. Nobody says it's good to fail. Of course, that's bad and you feel badly. But don't beat yourself up over it. Let's see how you can get through this thing. So yeah, people often ask that. Can you be so self-compassionate that you just say, everything's okay, and no matter what I do, I'm all right, and anything goes? And I would say no. I would say you're not being compassionate to yourself in the long run if you cut yourself that much slack.
Mm-hmm. So in what ways does something like self-reflection might help people deal with their problems?
Well, it can both increase their problems and it can help them deal with it. Because when something happens, we process it through a lens of self-interest. What does this mean for me? How does it affect my outcomes? If you think about it in a positive way, and I don't mean positive just like saying it's okay, but you think about it in a way that helps you deal with it and move on and improve from it, then it's going to be a positive outcome. If you think about it in a way that catastrophizes and makes it much worse than it is and is laden with self-criticism, then it's going to make things worse. So I think most people underestimate the degree to which they can affect the quality of their life by how they self-reflect on the things that happen to them. And I'm not an advocate of just making everything rosy and everything's okay and don't worry about it. But there are good coping strategies and there are bad coping strategies. And the good coping strategies involve self-reflecting on what happened in a way that helps you grow and adapt to the problem and cope with the problem and move on and doesn't get stuck just beating yourself up.
So at least some of these mechanisms that we've been talking about go associated with things like self-regulation, right?
If we weren't able to think consciously about ourselves, we could not self-regulate consciously. Now, we have a lot of automatic self-regulation, self-regulatory abilities. But if I am having a problem and I have to sit down and decide how to deal with it, there's self-reflection involved in solving the problem. Or if there's something about myself I don't like, I've got a bad habit, I need to lose weight or stop smoking or manage my temper, that requires self-reflection to sit down and decide what's my goal and how am I going to meet that goal, and then to catch myself when I reach for the cigarette or I'm starting to lose my temper or I'm grabbing the sweet. You have to self-reflect and say, well, no, this isn't consistent with your goals. So self-reflection is an important part of self-regulation. We couldn't pursue our goals consciously if we didn't stop to think about what we were doing.
Mm-hmm. But these things we're talking about here, like self-regulation, are they isolated mental mechanisms? Or, is it just simply another way of talking about things like, for example, I think that the literature says that the life outcomes that go associated with the ability to self-regulate also occur for people that are higher in IQ, for example, and also score higher on traits like conscientiousness from the Big Five. So what's the relationship between all of these different constructs that we have in psychology? Because sometimes it's a bit difficult to deal with them and to know if people are talking exactly about the same thing but using simply different terms, or if there's sort of a Venn diagram there and things overlap a little bit. How does it work?
That's a very good question. We are in a bad habit in behavioral science of using different words to refer to the same thing and the same word to refer to different things. So we struggle with that a lot. In terms of self-regulation has to do with managing your pursuit of your goals effectively. There are many different things that impact your particular ability to do that. Things about you and things about the context you're in. So you're absolutely right. If you have a disposition toward higher conscientiousness, you're going to be able to pursue your goals in a more deliberate and dependable and conscientious way. If you're higher in IQ, you can probably figure out a wider array of strategies that are going to work for you than if you're low in IQ. If you're a highly anxious person, your self-regulation can be derailed by focusing so much on your anxiety that you're not really focusing on the problem that you're trying to solve. So self-regulation itself is just a big catch-all term. You're right. It's a big category of things that involve how do we pursue our goals effectively and consciously. But there are dozens, if not hundreds of things that can impact how well you do that in a particular context. Some of those are personality things and intellectual things. Some of them are contextual. I can manage my desire for sweets really well if there's none in the house, but if they're sitting in here on the cabinet, yeah, then I'm going to break down. So self-regulation is also context dependent. But it all does involve self-reflection. So understanding how people can conjure up those thoughts that keep them on track in pursuing their goals is really important to getting people to regulate better.
Mm-hmm. So I referred to the big five personality traits, particularly to conscientiousness, and earlier we talked about self-reflection, and something that immediately came to my mind was that another trait of the big five is neuroticism. And I mean, there's a thin line perhaps between self-reflection that really helps people and what we call rumination, that is something that frequently occurs with people that are high on neuroticism and suffer from mood shifts and depression and general anxiety and things like that, right?
Absolutely. And it's not clear what the causal direction is. Probably both. I mean, if you ruminate too much in a negative way about you and your life, then you're going to score higher in neuroticism because you're going to have more negative emotions and emotional instability. But it's also true, if you're already experiencing negative emotions, and this is true for any of us, then you're going to ruminate more about the bad things that are happening because it becomes one of these vicious cycles. The basic personality traits, whether they're the big five or there are things even beyond the big five, certainly underlie virtually everything that I study. Those basic traits are responsible for some of the differences that we see across people in self-reflection, in hurt feelings, in social anxiety, in concerns with public impressions. Absolutely true. The question we often ask is the variable that we're studying, does it go beyond the big five? I mean, are we getting incremental explanatory power by beginning to look at something else that we're studying that goes beyond the fact that people just differ on these personality characteristics? But yeah, the big five are called the big five because they're big. They're responsible for an awful lot of differences that we see among people, and they're real things and they're really there. And most of what I study tries to go beyond the big five and say, well, what else can we learn if we dive a little deeper into some of these self-reflective processes?
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking a lot about many different psychological constructs and scientific constructs that we have in psychology to refer to mental mechanisms. Do you think that perhaps the research on these types of constructs has been very limited to the Western world, like Joe Henrich discovered the effect, what he called the weird effect? Do you know if these same mechanisms also occur in other cultures, non-Western cultures? I mean, is it across a human universal in any sense, or are we still studying that?
Yeah, we're still studying it. That's a very, very important question. Back before the days of the internet, it was so difficult to do cross-cultural psychological research that very little was done, so we didn't have any answers at all. Now, having the internet, it's much easier for researchers to collaborate across countries, to recruit participants who can be in very remote places, who can complete studies online. So it's getting much, much better. People obviously differ as a function of their cultures, and even as a function of their genetic groups, to the extent that different areas around the world have groups that have lived and inbred for hundreds of years. So people do differ. When we look at the processes, though, that underlie human behavior, most of the time you find that the relationships among the variables are pretty much the same. A lot of these are universal things. You don't find people who don't become socially anxious when they're worried about their impressions. I mean, that's sort of a universal. Do cultures differ in how important impressions are? Sure. Do they differ in the impressions that people want to make? Sure. But the basic processes are human processes. Now, I'm not saying that everything that we study has that kind of universality, but a lot of it is just the psychology of being a human being, and it's going to play out differently in different cultures, but the processes at the level of the brain are basically the same. We do find some exceptions, even in terms of understanding how the Big Five plays out, for example. But I've been encouraged by the fact that when you look at a process level, not just average differences on traits and things like that, those differ tremendously across cultural groups, but just the psychology of being human is remarkably universal.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, at least partially, some of these things that we've been talking about, we expect them to be innate or part of what we call human nature, at least to a certain extent.
The kinds of things I study seem to be that very basic motivational and emotional and cognitive processes. I'm sure there's a lot of specific things that are certainly not innate. I sort of hesitate to use that term because it often implies to people it's just going to sort of roll out automatically, as opposed to the fact that you have some very basic cognitive machinery that's processing information in particular predetermined ways. But yeah, at least for the things I study, again, I don't want to make a claim that all human behavior is like that, but stuff I study is pretty basic to human nature.
Yes, you refer to the fact or alluded to the fact that using the word innate is somewhat problematic because people would expect that if we're saying that a particular trait is innate, then it will develop independently of the circumstances and the types of information people are exposed to, and the brain doesn't need any sort of environmental inputs for that trait to develop in a proper way, let's say. Perhaps it's better in this sense to talk about traits as having biological basis or something like that, if we find that they occur virtually in all humans across the globe.
Yes, yeah, I think it's just a safer way to say it. In other animals, I mean, there's things that are clearly innate in the sense that this bird learns to fly without any help whatsoever, and all birds of that species fly in pretty much the same way. And human beings aren't quite like that. I also worry about the word innate because when lay people hear it, they often interpret it as unchangeable. That is,
as biologically determined or something like that.
100% biologically determined, instead of the fact, well, learning and experience and how you think about it can sort of push it around. The basic predisposition is there. It's clearly there biologically. It's probably evolved, but it can be pushed around by our extensive intellectual machinery that human beings have.
Mm-hmm. So just perhaps one last question or one last topic. We've been talking about how people think about themselves and how they deal with other people in their social milieus, let's say. And we have Robin Dunbar's number of 150 people that supposedly is the number of people that during our evolutionary history we were able to keep track of our interactions with them and to remember them and about how they are as people and if they reciprocate or not and if they cooperate or not and things like that. So do you think that perhaps we nowadays live in environments that because they are so different from what we had experienced during most of our evolutionary history that perhaps it's easier for us to develop certain sorts of what we call mental disorders, because I mean it's harder for us because we move places very frequently and we live very far from our families most of the time and things like that, for us to establish communities and for our identities to have a sort of continuity throughout our lives, that perhaps it's more difficult for us to apply these sort of positive mental mechanisms effectively, like self-compassion and self-reflection, and also to suffer more from things related to social exclusion and things like that.
You said that much better than I could have. You're absolutely right. I'm often amazed that we do as well as we do in modern life, given that our brains evolved under circumstances that are so dramatically different. I mean, living in a small clan of 30 to 50 people, many of whom you've known since birth, and it's very supportive. It's pretty egalitarian, and it's supportive. I mean, everybody's in this together, and they know they're in this together. And as you say, throw us out into a world where our lives are filled with strangers that we pass on the street every day, and we pick up and move, every few years, and people change jobs. I'm amazed we can function as well as we do. And if you put on top of the fact, I mean, you're talking about changes in our social structure where we've lost that cohesive social group, and now we're just surrounded by all these individuals with whom we have no relationships, which wouldn't have been the case throughout most of evolutionary time. When you combine that as well with other aspects of our lives, like our future orientation on top of that, during the evolutionary past, you lived for today. You didn't have any possessions. You didn't have any aspirations. You were talking about a future self. I just had to get through today. I had to get enough food for me and my family and not get killed by something. And that was a successful day. But now we spend so much of our time every day on things that we're not really doing for that day. It's for the future. It's for the paycheck. It's for the educational degree. It's for saving for retirement. We're looking years into the future instead of being rooted to our present circumstances. So if you combine that social change that you're talking about with the change in time orientation, so that most of what we do today is for what's going to happen in the future, I'm amazed we can function at all. I really am, when you think about how different our lives are. Wouldn't it be great to just get up in the morning without an alarm clock and just wander through the day? Not that life was easy, just walking through the African savannah, eating food all day long and taking a nap at noon and not having to worry about the deadlines and the pressure and the bank account and the future. Oh my God, some parts of that sound really good. Not that any of us want to go back there, but parts of that sound good.
Mm-hmm. So at least part of it has to do with the fact that our environments are very unpredictable, at least, and particularly when we think about our future and our future selves and things like that, and also that we have to deal with a lot of social information and even other sorts of information that we're not at least innately predisposed to those sorts of things. And so there's a kind of evolutionary mismatch occurring here.
Absolutely true. And when you think about the future problem, during evolutionary history, when there was a problem, it was a problem right now that you could do something about. Now, you might fail. The predator shows up, and maybe you're going to be eaten. But it was a problem for which you could take action right now. So many of our problems, as we think about our futures, there's nothing we can do right at this moment to make sure we have enough money to pay the rent next month. There's nothing we can do to make sure that we're going to get that educational degree or we're going to save enough for retirement. You can work on it, but you never know for sure whether you've succeeded or not in a given moment meeting your future goals. That kind of a concern just essentially did not exist for, the 7 million years from the time we split off from the lineage that became modern chimpanzees and bonobos. We didn't worry about that until about the last 10,000 years, and then we started building things and having possessions and having barns and herds of cattle, and we started worrying about our futures. We'd plant crops finally and have to worry about them, and we weren't present focused. And I think the self-reflection, to come back to that theme again, the self-reflection that's involved in us worrying about our futures, I don't know why we're all not completely insane worrying about stuff that we can't control. But you're right, there's a mismatch.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so great, Dr. Leary. Just before we go, would you like to tell people what would be some of the best places on the internet for them to find your work?
I do have a small blog at psychologytoday.com, and I will recommend a thing that I just began editing. That's not my work, but I am the new editor for the blog of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. It's called Character and Context. And we're publishing about 20 things a month of new findings in social and personality psychology, some of which deal with these themes and some of which don't, written by researchers about their own work and studies. We're trying to pick things that average lay listeners and readers will be interested in. It's called Character and Context. And I would just promote it for people who are curious and learning things in 600 words or less about particular new topics in social and personality psychology.
Okay, that's good to know. So I will be leaving links in the description box to all of your work and also those references that you've just made, Dr. Leary. And again, thank you a lot for taking the time to be here with us today. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show and to talk with you.
I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you so very much. You take care.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel on February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. You also have the alternative of supporting me on Subscribestar or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Peruga Larsen, Lau Guerreiro, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreanu, Jan Haninen, and my two producers, these are Webb and Rosie. Thank you for all.